They told me I was losing my mind when I said my own son sold my beloved beach house without my permission, just to line his pockets. 2 years later, I found out he'd already lost his own apartment because I had sold it out from under him. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning for years, I woke up to the same suffocating ritual. The sharp smell of stale coffee brewing in my tiny Brooklyn kitchen. The peeling paint on my apartment walls that I could never afford to fix. My knees aching as I shuffled to the window overlooking the worn asphalt parking lot below. The skyline of New York City illuminated my weary mornings, but the light felt cold, distant. Very much like the way my family treated me. That Tuesday in November changed everything. I remember the exact moment because I was wearing my faded blue robe, the one my late husband Robert bought me for our 30th anniversary. The fabric was soft from years of washing, but it still smelled faintly of his cologne if I buried my nose deep enough. I was stirring my lukewarm coffee with a bent spoon when my phone buzzed. An email from my middle son, Paul. The subject line made my stomach drop. Beach house situation resolved. I stared at those 3 words until they blurred. My hands trembled as I opened the message. 5 sentences. That's all he gave me. The beach house had been sold. No calls, no discussions, just a done deal. A betrayal wrapped in legal language and signed papers I'd never seen. I remember that house so well it still visits my dreams. The salty breeze of the Long Island shore that would tangle my hair and make me feel young again. The creaking wooden floorboards that sang a different song with each step. The faded quilt my late husband Robert sewed for me during his retirement, spread across the guest bed where grandchildren once slept. For 37 years, it was my sanctuary. A place where laughter echoed before bitterness crept in like morning fog. Paul had promised he would protect it, cherish it like I did. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd said just months before. "I'll take care of everything. You can trust me." Instead, he spat on that promise like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I stared at the email until my vision blurred. The cursor blinked mockingly on the screen. Was this my life now? Pain masquerading as family love? My coffee grew cold in my hands. Outside, New York City hummed with its usual chaos, but inside my small apartment, the silence was deafening. That beach house wasn't just a property. It was a promise I made to my late husband Robert that our family would always have roots, no matter how chaotic life got in the city. I can still see his weathered hands as he painted the shutters that final summer. "This place will keep us together, Helen," he whispered, his voice already thin from the illness that would take him 6 months later. "Promise me you'll fight for it." I kept that promise. For 15 years after he died, I kept it. All my life, I gave and gave. Rent money for their rising New York City apartments when they struggled with their careers. Dinners cooked with tired hands after long hospital shifts, my back aching as I stood over the stove preparing their favorite meals. Forgiveness for the sharp words when they forgot to call or visit. Silence when they treated me like an inconvenience rather than the woman who brought them into this world. I remember the cold silences that would fill my living room during family visits. The tense jawlines whenever I brought up money or asked for help with small things. My son Paul once snapped at me right here in this kitchen. "Mom, I'm not a charity case. Stop treating me like one." His words cut deep because I wasn't treating him like charity. I was treating him like my son. There's a difference, though apparently he couldn't see it. "You don't understand, Mom," my daughter Sarah whispered to me once after Paul stormed out. "Paul is under a lot of pressure with his business. He doesn't mean to sound harsh." But harsh words repeated often enough become a person's truth. I began to question myself. Was I just an ATM for a family that saw me as an endless fund? Maybe I was too blind, too desperate for their love to see their true colors. The signs were always there. I just chose to ignore them. Birthdays passed unmentioned except for hurried phone calls that felt more like obligations than celebrations. My 74th birthday came and went without a single card. When I mentioned it to Sarah, she sighed. "Mom, you know we're busy. We can celebrate next month." Next month never came. Illnesses were dismissed as just old age wearing me down. When I fractured my wrist falling down the subway stairs last October, I called each of my 3 children. Paul was too busy with a client meeting. Sarah had the kids' soccer practice. Danny, my youngest, didn't even return my call. I took myself to the emergency room, sat alone for 7 hours, and took a taxi home with my arm in a sling. The doctor's words still echo in my ears. "Isolation risks your health more than the fall, Mrs. Patterson. Do you have family support?" I lied and said yes. The loneliness crept in like winter cold, seeping through the cracks of my resolve. I would sit in my worn armchair, watching the shadows lengthen across my living room floor, wondering when I became invisible to the people I loved most. The apartment felt smaller each day, the walls closing in with memories of happier times, when this place bustled with children's laughter and family dinners. But it was the phone call from the apartment manager that almost shattered what little composure I had left. It was a rainy Thursday morning in March. I was organizing old photographs, trying to make sense of decades of memories, when my phone rang. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Mike from Sterling Property Management. I'm calling about your son Paul's apartment on East 89th Street." My heart stopped. Paul lived in that apartment for 8 years. I'd helped him with the security deposit when he first moved in, fresh out of college with big dreams and empty pockets. "What about his apartment?" I asked, though something in Mike's tone already told me I didn't want to hear the answer. "Ma'am, his rent has been overdue for nearly 6 months. We've been trying to reach him, but his phone seems disconnected. The apartment was sold to recover the debt, but according to our records, you're listed as the co-signer and authorized contact." The words hit me like ice water. Sold. His apartment had been sold. But how could that be? Paul never told me about any financial troubles. Never asked for help with rent. Never mentioned anything was wrong. I dug deeper that night, making phone calls and searching through paperwork I'd signed years ago. What I found made my hands shake with something between rage and heartbreak. The apartment had been quietly sold 3 months before my beach house was. A cold contract with my signature authorizing the sale to recover unpaid debts. I had signed it, yes. But only because I was desperate to recoup money I'd lent Paul over the years. Money he promised to pay back. Money that disappeared into the void of his failed business ventures. And he didn't know. Not until now. Not until this moment when the truth was crashing down on both of us like a house of cards in a hurricane. I screamed into the silence of my filthy kitchen. My voice cracked and echoed off the water-stained ceiling. The sound that came out of me wasn't human. It was the cry of an animal caught in a trap it didn't see being set. My hands were shaking so violently that the porcelain cup I was holding slipped from my fingers and shattered against the linoleum floor. The pieces scattered like my illusions, sharp fragments of what used to be whole. Silent tears traced the worn lines on my cheeks, lines carved by years of smiling when I wanted to scream, laughing when I wanted to cry, giving when I should have been receiving. For the first time in decades, I thought, no more, not like this. But even as the words formed in my mind, fear gripped me with icy fingers. I was alone, completely, utterly alone. Who else would take care of me if I said no to them? Who would visit when I was sick? Who would remember my birthday or call to check if I was still breathing? The fear was suffocating. Worse than the betrayal. Worse than the lies. Because at 74 years old, starting over feels impossible. The world outside my apartment seemed vast and hostile, full of younger people who moved faster, spoke louder, and had no patience for an old woman who was just trying to figure out how her life had become so small. That night, I packed away the old photo albums, Pictures of family vacations, graduation ceremonies, Christmas mornings when my children still looked at me with love instead of calculation. I couldn't bear to see their smiling faces knowing what I knew now. The photos went into a cardboard box, along with the illusions I'd carried for too many years. I stared long at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. An old woman's face stared back, full of regrets and hidden storms. 74 years of living? And for what? To be discarded like yesterday's newspaper when I was no longer useful? But something flickered in my eyes that night. Something I hadn't seen in years. Anger. Pure, clean anger that burned away the self-doubt. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being used, manipulated, and discarded by the very people who should have treasured me most. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront Paul. Face to face. No more emails or phone calls that could be ignored or twisted. I needed to look into his eyes and see what was left of the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything to support. I chose a grimy diner in Queens, neutral territory where neither of us could storm out dramatically. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like dishwater, but where conversations about life's disappointments seemed to belong. Paul arrived 20 minutes late. His hair was unwashed, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was clenched tight with the kind of tension that comes from carrying too many secrets. He slid into the booth across from me without apology. No hug, no kiss on the cheek. Just cold acknowledgement that we were both here for a conversation neither of us wanted to have. "You had no right." The words exploded out of him before I could even speak. His voice carried across the diner, turning heads at nearby tables. "You had no right to sell my apartment without telling me." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Without telling you? Paul, I signed those papers because you owed 6 months of rent, because you never told me you were in financial trouble, because you let me believe everything was fine while you were selling my beach house behind my back." His eyes hardened into chips of ice. "You never cared about what I was going through, never asked, never bothered to understand the pressure I was under." Never cared? My voice cracked with decades of suppressed hurt. "I gave you everything, Paul. Everything. Money, support, love, forgiveness for every cruel word, every broken promise, every time you treated me like I was nothing more than a bank account with emotions." But he wasn't listening. He was building his defense, brick by brick, the way he'd learned to do as a child when caught in lies. "You don't understand business, Mom. The beach house was just sitting there, empty most of the year. It made sense to liquidate the asset. I was trying to help the family finances." "Help the family finances?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Or help yourself? Where did that money go, Paul? Because it certainly didn't come to me." He looked away, focusing on something over my shoulder rather than meeting my eyes. In that moment, I saw him clearly for the first time in years. Not the successful businessman he pretended to be. Not the loving son I'd told myself he was. Just a scared, desperate man who'd learned that manipulation got him what he needed better than honesty ever could. My youngest daughter, Sarah, chose that moment to walk in, her heels clicking against the dirty linoleum floor like a countdown timer. She slid into the booth next to Paul, presenting a united front against the woman who'd given birth to them both. Sarah flicked her perfectly styled hair and avoided my gaze. Her manicured nails drummed against the Formica table in a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. "Maybe it's time you stopped playing the martyr, Mom," she said, her voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that cuts deepest. "We're all adults here. We need to make practical decisions." Playing the martyr. As if loving them had been some kind of performance. As if every sacrifice I'd made was just an act designed to make them feel guilty. The words hung in the air between us like poison gas. My husband Robert would have pleaded for peace if he were still alive. He would have found some way to bridge the gap, to make everyone feel heard and loved. But Robert was gone, and I was facing this storm alone. Yet even in that moment of complete family rebellion, a small miracle happened. As I walked home through my Queens neighborhood, feeling beaten down and smaller than I'd felt in years, my neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, appeared at my door with a plate of empanadas and kind eyes that held no judgment, no calculation, no hidden agenda. "You look like you need a friend," she said softly in her gentle voice that carried the hint of an accent from her childhood in Puerto Rico. "And I make these better than anyone in the building." Mrs. Ramirez listened when no one else would. Her living room became my sanctuary, her laughter a salve on wounds I thought would never heal. She didn't try to fix me or give me advice. She just sat with me in the pain and reminded me that I wasn't invisible, that I still mattered to someone in this world. "You know what I learned after 40 years of marriage?" she told me one afternoon as we shared coffee and stories. "Sometimes the family you choose loves you better than the family you're born with. Blood doesn't make people kind, Helen. Kindness makes people family." Her words planted a seed in the barren ground of my heart. For the first time in months, I began to imagine what life might look like if I stopped begging for crumbs and started demanding the full meal of respect I deserved. The next morning, my phone buzzed with Paul's usual text message asking for money. This time it was for his business expenses, an emergency that couldn't wait, the same urgent tone he'd used dozens of times before when he needed me to solve his problems with my checkbook. I stared at the message for a long time. My finger hovered over the keyboard as muscle memory almost typed out, "How much do you need?" But something had shifted overnight. Some internal switch had been flipped from desperation to determination. "No," I typed back. My hands were trembling, but my resolve was firm. Just one word. Simple. Clean. Final. The response came immediately. 3 paragraphs of emotional manipulation. How could I abandon him when he needed me most? Didn't I care about his family's welfare? Was I really so selfish that I'd let pride come between us? I read every word, felt the familiar stab of guilt that had controlled me for so many years. But this time, something was different. This time, the guilt felt foreign, like a coat that no longer fit properly. I deleted his message without responding. The power I had given them was draining me dry, and I was finally ready to turn off the tap. That afternoon, I walked to the Brooklyn Legal Help Center. It was a long subway ride, and my arthritis made the walk from the station challenging, but I needed to be there in person. I needed to see the faces of people who would help me protect what little I had left. The building was older than I expected, with worn marble floors and the kind of institutional lighting that makes everyone look slightly sick. But the young lawyer who met with me had kind eyes and spoke to me like I was intelligent, capable, worthy of respect. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, spreading my documents across her desk, "you have more options than you realize. Just because your family expects certain things from you doesn't mean you're legally obligated to provide them." Legal obligation. The phrase stuck with me as I rode the subway home. I'd been confusing love with legal obligation for so long that I'd forgotten the difference. Love should lift you up, not drain your bank account. Love should make you feel valued, not used. For the first time in years, I slept soundly that night. No worry creeping through my dreams about unpaid bills or family emergencies that somehow always became my responsibility to solve. Just deep, peaceful sleep that comes from knowing you've started the journey back to yourself. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. A quiet rebellion, a reclamation of self that had been buried under decades of trying to buy affection with financial support. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Paul called repeatedly, his messages cycling through anger, bargaining, and attempts at emotional manipulation. Sarah sent long emails about family loyalty and the importance of helping each other through difficult times. Danny, my youngest son who rarely contacted me anyway, suddenly became very interested in my well-being, calling to check on my mental state and suggesting I might need professional help for my recent erratic behavior. But I held firm. Mrs. Ramirez would remind me during our afternoon coffee sessions that saying no to disrespect wasn't the same as saying no to love. "Real love doesn't come with invoices, Helen," she would say, her warm hand covering mine. "Real love doesn't make you feel small." The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It happened in small moments scattered throughout ordinary days. The morning I realized I hadn't checked my phone anxiously for crisis messages. The afternoon I spent reading a novel instead of balancing checkbooks for grown children who should have been managing their own finances. The evening I cooked dinner for one and enjoyed every bite without feeling guilty for not preparing extra portions for family members who might drop by expecting to be fed. Spring arrived in Brooklyn with its usual mixture of hope and skepticism. The trees on my street bloomed tentatively, as if they weren't quite sure winter was really over. I felt the same way about my own transformation, hopeful but cautious, ready for change but aware that real change takes time to take root. That's when I decided it was time for one final confrontation. Not because I owed them an explanation, but because I owed myself the dignity of speaking my truth clearly and completely. I suggested we meet at the old family diner where we'd gathered for celebrations in better times. The same place where my children had blown out birthday candles and shared excited stories about school and friends and dreams for the future. It felt appropriate to close this chapter in a place where so many other chapters had begun. I arrived early and chose a corner booth where I could see the door. I'd brought an envelope with me, thick with legal documents that represented months of quiet work to protect my remaining assets. Papers that ensured my savings would be there for genuine emergencies, not borrowed against fake crises. Paul arrived first, looking haggard and defensive. Sarah came next, her phone glued to her ear as she finished what sounded like a work call. Danny shuffled in last, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets like a teenager who'd been dragged to a family meeting against his will. They arranged themselves across from me in a line of solidarity that would have been touching if it had been motivated by love instead of financial concern. "Mom, we're worried about you," Sarah began, her voice carrying the patronizing tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone whose mental capacity is in question. "You've been acting strangely lately, making decisions that don't make sense." I pulled the envelope from my purse and placed it on the table between us, their eyes fixed on it like it might contain either salvation or damnation, depending on what was inside. "You're right," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I have been making decisions that don't make sense. For years, I've been making decisions that prioritize your comfort over my dignity, your wants over my needs, your financial problems over my financial security." I opened the envelope and pulled out a faded photograph. It was a picture of all of us at the beach house during what I now knew was our last family vacation there. We were all smiling, arms thrown around each other, sun-kissed and happy. The image of a family that no longer existed, if it ever really had. With trembling hands but a clear heart, I tore the photograph in half, then in half again. The pieces fluttered onto the Formica table like confetti from a celebration I was no longer attending. Paul's face went white. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I'm doing what I should have done years ago," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm choosing reality over fantasy. I'm choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice." I pulled out the legal documents and spread them across the table. Property transfers, changed bank account authorizations, updated will provisions that reflected the current reality of our relationships rather than the idealized version I'd clung to for too long. "You sold my beach house without permission," I continued, looking directly at Paul. "And I sold your apartment to recover money you owed me but never planned to repay. We're even now. But more importantly, We're done pretending this family functions on love and mutual respect instead of financial manipulation and emotional blackmail. Sarah's carefully composed facade cracked. You're being ridiculous, Mom. Families help each other. That's what families do. Help each other? I laughed, but this time there was strength in the sound instead of bitterness. When was the last time any of you helped me with anything? When was the last time you called to ask how I was feeling instead of how much money I could contribute to your latest crisis? The question hung in the air like smoke. None of them could answer because the answer would have revealed the truth we'd all been dancing around for years. Danny shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The son who'd inherited his father's gentle nature, but somehow misplaced his father's kindness along the way. Mom, you're our mother. It's your job to take care of us. I was your mother, I corrected him. When you were children, it was my job to take care of you. To teach you right from wrong, to provide for your needs, to prepare you to be decent human beings who could take care of themselves and maybe someday take care of others. But you're not children anymore. You're adults who've chosen to treat your mother like a resource instead of a person. I looked at each of their faces, searching for any sign of the children I'd loved so completely that I'd lost myself in the process. They were still there, buried under years of entitlement and selective memory, but they were not the people sitting across from me in this booth. Paul tried one more angle, his voice taking on the manipulative sweetness that had worked so many times before. Mom, I know I made mistakes. We all did. But we can fix this. We're family. Family forgives. Family forgives, I agreed. But family also respects. Family also protects. Family also loves without conditions or invoices. I gathered the legal papers back into the envelope. I will no longer buy love. I will no longer pay for the privilege of being treated poorly by the people who should cherish me most. I stood up from the booth, my legs steadier than they'd been in years. Respect me or lose me. Those are your choices now. The same choices I should have given you years ago instead of teaching you that my love could be taken for granted and my bank account treated like your personal emergency fund. The air in the diner grew thick with tension and unspoken truths. Other customers were trying not to stare, but I could feel their curiosity like heat from a radiator. Part of me was embarrassed to be having this conversation in public, but a larger part of me was proud to finally be having it at all. I walked out of that diner with my head high and my heart lighter than it had been in decades. Behind me, I could hear the urgent whispers of my children trying to figure out their next move. But their next move was no longer my concern. For the first time in years, my next move was my own decision to make. Walking down the Brooklyn street toward the subway station, I felt like I was walking toward a life I'd forgotten was possible. A life where my worth wasn't measured by my willingness to solve other people's problems, where my value wasn't calculated by the balance in my checking account. But the story wasn't over yet. Life rarely lets you have clean endings, and my family wasn't finished trying to regain control over their discovered ATM machine. Just as I was starting to breathe more easily, to sleep through the night without worrying about crisis phone calls, Paul launched his final attack. It was more vicious than I'd expected, and it caught me completely off guard. I was having coffee with Mrs. Ramirez when her phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. Her expression changed as she read, her kind eyes filling with concern and something that looked like anger. "Helen," she said carefully, "I think you need to see this." She handed me her phone, and what I saw made my stomach plummet like an elevator with cut cables. Paul had posted a long, detailed message on his Facebook page, and it had been shared dozens of times already. The post painted me as a greedy, heartless woman who had stolen his home and abandoned her family in their time of need. "My mother has chosen money over family," the post read. "After everything we've done for her over the years, she's decided to punish us for trying to help manage her finances. She sold my apartment without warning and is now refusing to help her own children and grandchildren. I'm sharing this because I want people to know the truth about elder abuse. Sometimes it's the elders who do the abusing. The comments were filling up with sympathy for my poor son and condemnation for the terrible mother who had betrayed her family's trust. People who had never met me, never heard my side of the story, were calling me selfish, bitter, and cruel. Some suggested I was suffering from dementia or mental illness. Others recommended family counseling or legal intervention. For a moment, the familiar stab of shame and self-doubt pierced through all the progress I'd made. The old Helen would have called Paul immediately, apologizing and begging him to take down the post. She would have offered money to make the embarrassment go away. But I wasn't the old Helen anymore. I handed Mrs. Ramirez her phone back and took a sip of my coffee. It tasted the same as it had 5 minutes earlier, before my private family drama became public entertainment for people who had nothing better to do than judge situations they didn't understand. "Aren't you going to respond?" Mrs. Ramirez asked gently. I considered it. I could write my own Facebook post explaining the years of financial manipulation, the broken promises, the emotional neglect. I could defend myself with receipts and bank statements and documentation of every dollar I'd given and every kindness I'd shown that had been repaid with indifference. But what would be the point? The people commenting on Paul's post weren't interested in truth. They were interested in drama. They wanted a villain in this story, and Paul had given them one. Fighting back would only feed the fire and give them more entertainment at my expense. "No," I said, surprised by how calm I felt. "I'm not going to respond." This silence was different from the silence I'd lived in for years. That had been the silence of fear, of trying to keep peace at any cost. This was the silence of dignity, of refusing to participate in a performance designed to humiliate me. My silence became my armor, my power, my final statement. I would not defend myself against lies because the people who mattered already knew who I was, and the people sharing condemnation from strangers didn't matter at all. The post eventually disappeared into the endless scroll of social media outrage, replaced by newer scandals and fresher controversies. But it had served Paul's purpose. It was his final attempt to punish me for choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice, his last manipulation to try to force me back into the role of family martyr and financial resource. It didn't work. If anything, it confirmed that I'd made the right choice. A son who truly loved his mother wouldn't try to publicly humiliate her. A man with genuine character wouldn't lie to strangers to gain sympathy for his own poor choices. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror again. The same cracked glass, the same 74-year-old face. But something fundamental had changed. The woman looking back at me had survived the worst her own children could dish out and discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. Spring turned to summer, and with Mrs. Ramirez's encouragement, I did something I'd been putting off for decades. I joined a community arts class at the local senior center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was too busy solving everyone else's problems. The class met twice a week in a bright room with tall windows that let in afternoon sunlight. The instructor, a patient woman named Janet who couldn't have been older than 35, treated us all like serious artists instead of elderly people who were just trying to fill time. I painted again for the first time since high school. My hands were shakier now, and my eyes weren't as sharp, but the feeling of soft brush strokes against canvas brought colors back to days that had been grayscale for too long. I painted Brooklyn street scenes. The view from my apartment window transformed into something beautiful instead of depressing. I painted memories of the beach house, but now they felt like celebrations of experiences I'd had rather than losses I was mourning. The other people in the class became my unexpected community. Margaret, who'd been widowed for 15 years and was just learning that life could still hold surprises. William, whose children lived across the country and who'd discovered that loneliness and solitude were completely different experiences. Rosa, who spoke 3 languages and had raised 6 children and was now finally doing something just for herself. We became friends in the way that only people who've survived decades of life's complications can be friends. We didn't need to pretend our lives had been perfect or that our families always appreciated us. We could be honest about disappointments and grateful for small joys without judgment or advice we didn't want. I bought myself a bright yellow jacket that summer, the kind of sunny color I'd never worn when I was trying to fade into the background of other people's lives. It felt like wearing sunshine, like carrying a piece of optimism everywhere I went. The jacket became my signature. People in the neighborhood started recognizing me as the lady in yellow, who always had a kind word for the bodega owner and who could be seen sitting on her building's front steps with a cup of coffee, watching the world go by with curious eyes instead of anxious ones. One evening in late August, as I was coming home from art class with a canvas still wet with paint, I found Sarah waiting on my front steps. She looked smaller than I remembered, her designer clothes somehow making her seem more fragile instead of more impressive. "Hi, Mom," she said quietly, standing up as I approached. "Could we talk?" For a moment, my heart leaped with the old hope that my daughter had come to apologize, to rebuild the relationship we'd lost. But I was wiser now, more careful with my hope. I'd learned that people usually only changed their behavior when the consequences of not changing became too expensive. "Of course," I said, unlocking the building's front door. "But not because you need something from me, only if you want to actually talk to me." She followed me up the stairs to my apartment, her heels clicking against the worn marble steps. Inside, she looked around at the changes I'd made. The walls I'd painted a warm cream color instead of landlord white. The small paintings I'd hung of Brooklyn scenes that made my space feel more like home. The yellow throw pillows that picked up the color of my new jacket. "The place looks nice," she said, and I could tell she was surprised. The old Helen had lived in an apartment that looked like she was just passing through. This Helen had made a home. "Thank you," I said, putting my painting supplies away and starting the coffee maker. "What did you want to talk about?" Sarah sat down in my reading chair, the one I'd bought myself after deciding that my emotional comfort was worth the expense. She looked out of place among my new decorations, like she belonged to the old version of this apartment and wasn't sure how to navigate the updated version. "I wanted to apologize," she began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Before you continue," I said, "I need to know if you're apologizing because you're genuinely sorry for how you treated me, or because you've discovered you need something from me and apologies are part of your strategy to get it." The question hung in the air like incense, thick and impossible to ignore. Sarah's face went through several expressions as she processed what I'd asked, and more importantly, what the fact that I'd asked it said about the changes in our relationship dynamic. "I'm sorry," she said finally, and tears started forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry because I've been a terrible daughter. I'm sorry because I let Paul convince me that your feelings didn't matter as much as our financial problems. I'm sorry because I never asked about your life, never wondered if you were lonely or scared, or needed someone to take care of you for a change." The tears were real, and they fell onto my yellow throw pillow as she spoke. These weren't the calculated tears of manipulation. These were the messy, ugly tears that come from genuine shame and regret. "I'm sorry because I let you become invisible to us," she continued, her voice breaking. "And I didn't realize how much I'd missed you until you were gone." I sat down across from her and really looked at my daughter for the first time in years. Not the entitled, demanding woman who treated me like a resource, but the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. Not the adult who took my sacrifices for granted, but the child who used to make me Mother's Day cards with stick figure drawings of us holding hands. "What changed?" I asked gently. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup but not caring. "I started going to therapy after Paul's Facebook post got so much attention. My therapist asked me to describe my relationship with you, and I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't tell her anything about your hopes or dreams or fears or joys. I could only talk about what you gave us and what we needed from you." She took a shaky breath before continuing. "Then she asked me to imagine how I'd feel if my own children treated me the way I'd been treating you. And I broke down crying because I realized I would feel worthless, used, invisible." The honesty in her voice was something I hadn't heard from any of my children in years. It wasn't prettied up or softened with excuses. It was raw truth offered without expectation of immediate forgiveness. "I can't undo the years of taking you for granted," Sarah said. "I can't give you back the birthdays we ignored, or the times you were sick and we were too busy to care. But I want to try to know you now. Not as our mother who fixes things, but as Helen who paints and drinks coffee and has opinions about books and politics and art." I poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to my daughter. The coffee was strong, the way I'd learned to make it for myself instead of the weak version I used to make because Robert preferred it that way, and habit had made me continue brewing it for a ghost. "That sounds nice," I said, and meant it. "But it means you'd have to be interested in me as a person, not just as your mother. It means conversations where you ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. It means accepting that I have a life now that doesn't revolve around solving your problems." "I'd like that," Sarah said. "I'd really like that." We talked until the sun set over Brooklyn, painting the walls of my apartment in shades of orange and pink that would have made beautiful painting subjects. Sarah told me about her marriage, her struggles with feeling dissatisfied despite having everything she thought she wanted. I told her about my art class, about Mrs. Ramirez's friendship, about the peace I'd found in putting myself first for the first time in my adult life. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Too much damage had been done for that. But it was a beginning, a tiny green shoot of possibility growing up through cracked concrete. Sarah started calling every Sunday afternoon, not when she needed something, but just to check in. Our conversations were tentative at first, like 2 people learning a new language together. But gradually, they became more natural, more genuine. She came to one of my art classes and met my friends. She seemed surprised to discover that I had friends, that I was capable of being interesting to people who didn't share my DNA. Paul and Danny didn't follow Sarah's example. Paul disappeared completely after his Facebook campaign failed to bring me back into line. Danny made a few awkward attempts at contact, but they felt obligatory rather than sincere. I wished things could have been different, but I wasn't willing to buy their affection anymore, and they weren't interested in giving it freely. The holidays that year were different. Instead of cooking for an army and hoping my family would show up, I had a quiet Thanksgiving dinner with Mrs. Ramirez and her daughter's family. Instead of spending my savings on Christmas gifts for people who wouldn't appreciate them, I bought myself an easel and high-quality paints that would last for years. Sarah came for Christmas morning coffee, bringing stories about her children and asking about my paintings. We exchanged small, thoughtful gifts. She gave me a book about famous female artists who didn't become successful until later in life. I gave her a small painting of the view from my window, the same view that had once seemed depressing but now looked like possibility. As winter melted into spring, I realized I'd made it through an entire year of living for myself instead of living for other people's approval. The world hadn't ended. I hadn't died of loneliness or regret. In fact, I'd discovered that I enjoyed my own company, that I was interesting enough to entertain myself. My savings account was growing for the first time in years. Without the constant drain of family emergencies and guilt-induced loans, I could actually plan for my future instead of just surviving from crisis to crisis. I started thinking about trips I wanted to take, art museums I'd always meant to visit, books I wanted to read without interruption, people I'd like to meet in my remaining years. The beach house was gone, but my memories of the good times there were intact. The pain of losing it had transformed into something else. Relief, maybe. or freedom from the burden of trying to hold on to something that had already been lost the moment my family started seeing it as a commodity instead of a sanctuary. One afternoon in May, almost a year after the diner confrontation, I was sitting on my building's front steps in my yellow jacket, enjoying coffee and people watching, when a young woman stopped in front of me. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the artist? My neighbor said there's a woman in this building who takes art classes and paints beautiful pictures of the neighborhood." The question startled me. Artist. No one had ever called me an artist before. In my mind, artists were other people, younger people, more talented people. But here was a stranger identifying me by my art instead of my relationships or disappointments or past mistakes. "I take art classes," I said carefully. "I wouldn't call myself an artist." "Would you call yourself a painter?" she asked, smiling. "Yes, I suppose I would." "Then you're an artist," she said simply. "I'm opening a small gallery in the neighborhood, and I'm looking for local artists who capture the spirit of Brooklyn. Would you be interested in showing some of your work?" I almost laughed. The idea was absurd. But then I thought about the paintings stacked in my closet, the street scenes and apartment views that I'd been creating just for the joy of making something beautiful. Why shouldn't they be seen by other people? "I might be interested," I said, surprising myself. Her name was Carmen, and she was barely 30 years old with the kind of enthusiastic energy that could have annoyed me if it weren't so genuine. She came up to my apartment and looked through my paintings with the seriousness of someone who actually understood art. "These are wonderful," she said, holding up a painting of children playing in the street while their mothers watched from fire escapes. "You've captured something real here, something honest." Honest. That word stayed with me as Carmen selected 5 paintings for her gallery opening. Honest was exactly what I'd been learning to be. Honest about my needs, my worth, my right to take up space in the world. The gallery opening was on a Thursday evening in June. I wore my yellow jacket and a new pair of earrings I'd bought myself just because they made me feel pretty. Sarah came, bringing flowers and genuine excitement about seeing her mother's art displayed like it mattered. Mrs. Ramirez was there with her entire family, proudly telling everyone that I was her friend and neighbor. My art class friends came, and we stood in front of my paintings like we were all famous artists at the Metropolitan Museum. A few people bought my paintings. Strangers gave me money for pictures I'd created, valuing something I'd made enough to want to take it home with them. It felt surreal and wonderful, and like a form of validation I'd never experienced before. But the most important moment came when I was standing alone in front of my favorite painting. It was the view from my apartment window, but transformed with warm colors and soft light that made the ordinary scene look magical. A woman about my age stopped beside me and looked at the painting for a long moment. "This feels like home," she said quietly. "Like someone who loves this place painted it." She was right. I had painted it with love. Love for my neighborhood, my community, my small apartment that had become a sanctuary instead of a prison. Love for the life I'd built after deciding I was worth building a life for. "I do love this place," I told her. "It took me a long time to realize it, but I do." That night, I went home to my painted walls and yellow throw pillows, my easel and my stack of finished paintings. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in my reading chair, looking out at the Brooklyn street scene I'd painted dozens of times. 6 months later, I sit by my window as December snow starts falling on the New York streets below. The coffee in my hands is hot and strong, made exactly the way I like it. Sunlight filters through sheer curtains I bought because they made the room feel softer, more welcoming. The beach house is gone, sold without my permission, but no longer a source of daily grief. Paul's apartment was sold too, a practical decision that freed me from the burden of being responsible for his financial mistakes. These losses, which once felt devastating, have transformed into something else. Liberation. Liberation from the exhausting job of trying to hold together a family that had chosen to see me as a resource rather than a person. Carmen's gallery has become a regular venue for my work. I have 3 paintings on display right now, and 2 of them have sold this week. People pay money for beauty I've created, validation I never expected to receive in the 8th decade of my life. Sarah calls every Sunday and visits twice a month. Our relationship isn't perfect, but it's real now in a way it never was when it was built on obligation and financial dependence. She asks about my art, my friends, my thoughts on books and movies and current events. She sees me as Helen first and her mother second, which turns out to be a much healthier dynamic for both of us. Paul and Danny have faded into occasional memories, like photographs tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. I wish things could have been different, but I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my peace for their emotional comfort. Mrs. Ramirez and I have coffee 3 times a week now. We've become the kind of friends who don't need to fill every silence with words, who can sit companionably reading books or watching the street life unfold below our windows. She's teaching me to cook Puerto Rican food, and I'm teaching her to paint. We're both in our 70s and still learning new things about ourselves and each other. My art class friends have become my chosen family, the people who celebrate my small victories and check on me when I'm feeling under the weather. We have dinner together once a week, and we're planning a group trip to Philadelphia to see an art museum none of us have visited before. I sleep deeply now, without the anxiety that used to keep me awake worrying about family crises that somehow always became my emergencies to solve. My savings account grows a little each month, money I can spend on myself without guilt or careful justification. The yellow jacket has become my signature piece, but I've added other bright colors to my wardrobe too. Red scarves and purple sweaters and earrings that catch the light when I turn my head. I dress for myself now, not to fade into the background or avoid attention. The mirror in my bathroom still has the same crack, but the woman looking back at me has changed completely. There's light in her eyes now, confidence in her posture. She looks like someone who matters, who takes up space in the world without apology. 2 years ago, I thought my life was ending. I thought I'd raised children who would care for me in my old age, and I thought financial generosity would ensure emotional loyalty. I was wrong on both counts, but being wrong about those things led me to discover something much better. I discovered that I could care for myself. I discovered that emotional loyalty can't be purchased, but self-respect can be reclaimed at any age. I discovered that it's never too late to start living authentically, to stop performing gratitude for crumbs, and start demanding the full meal of dignity I'd always deserved. The woman I am now would be a stranger to the woman who woke up that November morning 2 years ago to find out her beach house had been sold by her own son. That woman lived in fear of being alone, of being unloved, of being seen as difficult or selfish. This woman knows the difference between being alone and being lonely, knows that love without respect is just manipulation with pretty words. Life taught me that worth isn't given by others. Worth isn't earned through sacrifice or purchased through generosity. Worth is inherent, something you're born with and can only lose if you give it away. I gave mine away for decades, and the miracle is that when I finally decided to take it back, it was still there waiting for me. The snow is falling harder now, covering the Brooklyn street in clean white that makes everything look new and full of possibility. I'm 76 years old, and I'm just getting started living the life I want instead of the life everyone else expected me to live. A warm glass of wine sits on the table beside me, red wine that I drink because I enjoy the taste, not because someone else recommended it or because it was on sale. I'm watching the New York sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that would make a beautiful painting. Maybe I'll paint it tomorrow, or maybe I'll just sit here and enjoy it for what it is. This is what freedom looks like. This is what self-respect feels like. This is what happens when you stop begging for love and start commanding respect. But tonight feels different somehow, special, because tomorrow marks exactly 2 years since that November morning when everything changed. 2 years since I discovered that the family I thought I knew existed only in my imagination. 2 years since I began the journey from invisible martyr to visible, valued woman. I've been thinking about writing letters to my younger self, the woman who stood at kitchen windows for decades, wondering why love felt so much like obligation, why generosity never seemed to generate genuine affection in return. I want to tell her that the answer isn't to give more, sacrifice more, shrink more. The answer is to expect more, demand more, be more. I want to tell her that the people who truly love you will never make you choose between your dignity and their comfort. That real family relationships feel like shelter, not storms you have to constantly weather. That being alone with integrity is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who value your checkbook more than your character. The phone rings, interrupting my thoughts. It's Sarah, calling earlier than her usual Sunday schedule. "Mom," she says, and I can hear excitement in her voice. "I have news. Good news. I've been accepted into a master's program in social work. I'm going to specialize in family counseling, helping people rebuild relationships that have been damaged by financial manipulation and emotional neglect." I smile, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that has nothing to do with the wine or the heated apartment. My daughter has learned something from our family's breakdown. She's turning our painful experience into something that might help other families before they reach the crisis point we did. That's wonderful, Sarah. I'm proud of you. I want to thank you, Mom, she continues, for having the courage to say no to us, for forcing us to confront what we'd become. I know it was hard and I know it hurt, but it saved whatever was left of our relationship that was worth saving. After we hang up, I sit quietly in the gathering dusk, thinking about the unexpected gifts that sometimes come wrapped in the most painful packages. My family's betrayal had felt like the end of everything. Instead, it became the beginning of discovering who I was underneath all the roles I'd been playing, all the expectations I'd been meeting, all the love I'd been purchasing with my own diminishment. The snow has covered the street completely now, muffling the usual city sounds and creating a sense of peaceful isolation that no longer frightens me. I remember how terrified I used to be of quiet moments like this, when there was no crisis to solve, no emergency to fund, no family drama to navigate. The silence used to feel like evidence of my failure, proof that I wasn't needed or wanted. Now I understand that silence is where you meet yourself, where you discover what you actually think and feel when you're not performing for an audience, where you realize that your own company can be the most restoring company of all. Tomorrow, I'll wake up and make coffee exactly the way I like it. I'll put on bright colors that make me feel alive. I'll walk to my art class and spend 2 hours painting something that exists only because I want it to exist, not because it serves anyone else's purpose or meets anyone else's needs. I'll have lunch with Mrs. Ramirez and we'll laugh about something silly one of our neighbors did, or share a quiet sadness about something we've lost, or dream together about places we want to visit before we're too old to travel. Our friendship is built on mutual interest and genuine affection, not on what we can do for each other or how much we can sacrifice for each other's comfort. Tomorrow evening, I might sell another painting to a stranger who sees something beautiful in the way I perceive my small corner of Brooklyn. Or I might not sell anything, which would be fine too, because the value of making art isn't determined by its commercial success. The value is in the making itself, in the act of creating something that didn't exist before I touched brush to canvas. And maybe, if I feel like it, I'll call Sarah and ask her about her classes, her husband, her children, who are my grandchildren, but who I'm just now learning to know as individual people, rather than extensions of their parents' needs and problems. Or maybe I won't call anyone. Maybe I'll just sit here in my beautiful life, reading a book that interests me, or watching the snow fall on the street I've learned to love, drinking wine that tastes good, and wearing clothes that make me happy, and existing in the radical act of being enough exactly as I am. This is what I never understood during all those years of trying to earn love through endless giving. The people who are meant to be in your life will want to be there with you as you are, not as you perform yourself to be. They'll value your thoughts as much as your financial contributions. They'll be interested in your dreams as much as your ability to solve their nightmares. The rest will fall away, and their absence will feel like relief rather than abandonment. Because you can't lose what you never really had, and what you never really had was their genuine love and respect. What you always had was your own worth, waiting patiently for you to remember it existed. What you always had was your own capacity for joy, buried under years of other people's expectations but never destroyed. What you always had was your own beautiful, irreplaceable self, worthy of love not because of what you could provide, but simply because you are here, you are human, you are enough. The wine glass is empty now, and the snow has stopped falling. The street outside my window looks like a painting I might create someday, all soft edges and gentle light. In the distance, the city continues its endless rhythm, full of people learning their own lessons about love and worth and the courage it takes to choose yourself. I wash the wine glass and put it away, turn off the lights in my small, perfect apartment, and prepare for sleep. Tomorrow will bring new possibilities, new moments to practice self-respect, new opportunities to live authentically in this beautiful, difficult world. 2 years ago, I thought I was losing everything. Instead, I was finally ready to find myself.